So then, it is time for the press preview. As always, it's our first look at the front pages. And tonight, having a look at the headlines, Guardian columnist Zoe Williams and the former Conservative Special Advisor, Salma Shah. They'll both be with us from now until just before midnight. Good evening to both of you. We'll chat in a second after we've had a look at those front pages for you. Why don't we start with the Express, leading with a long-awaited conviction for the murder of 7-year-old Nikki Allen, whose family blamed police for her killer remaining at large for 31 years. The Eye reports that the former Home Secretary, Priti Patel, has accused Rishi Sunak of overseeing what she called the managed decline of the Conservative Party. According to The Guardian, Sir Keir Starmer is expected to give a speech tomorrow in which he'll insist that if elected, Labour must introduce reforms that go further and deeper than those brought in by Tony Blair in 1997. The Times hears from the businessman Sir James Dyson, who believes the government's focus on investment in science and technology is political posturing. While the FT has news of diplomatic tensions, with the US government accusing their South African counterparts of funneling arms to the Russians. Here's tomorrow's Telegraph saying India is planning to insist that Britain should return treasures it plundered during the colonial era, including the controversial Kohinoor diamond, which is one of the crown jewels. The paper shows those jewels on its front page as the King poses with his son and grandson in a newly released picture. The Mail brings attention to its campaign to allow tax-free shopping for overseas tourists in the UK, while the Mirror carries claims about TV presenter Philip Schofield's future on This Morning. Phil fights for job, the headline. The Sun suggests that one issue at the centre of it all is a row with his fellow presenter Holly Willoughby. And I won't read the headline, but according to The Star, the Pope has some thoughts about the intimate habits of Italians. Goodness. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you can see on screen during the programme, you can check out those front pages while you watch us discussing them. And to do exactly that, Zoe Williams and Salma Shah. Great to have you with us this Friday evening. Salma, why don't you kick things off for us, looking at the front of the Eye, the former Home Secretary attacking the current Prime Minister?
Yes, and in normal times, I think that would make quite a big splash, as it has with the Eye, but I would treat this with a bit of scepticism. So the former Home Secretary, Priti Patel, has come out and said that Rishi Sunak, as a consequence of the local elections, the dire local election results of the Conservatives, is managing the decline of the party. And it's not a surprise because Priti Patel was a strong, staunch ally of the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And for a while, it's been in the pipeline that there is going to be some kind of attack from the Boris Johnson loyalists against Rishi Sunak, and it was going to be around the time of the local elections. So this is very much part of that. But I think a lot of people from the Boris Johnson supporter group are going to rally around this line in an attempt to potentially bring back that former Prime Minister.
Just quickly, before we go to Zoe, Salma, how much of a threat are they, do you think?
Look, I think the issue is this is all in the prism of a new organisation called the Conservative Democratic Organisation, which claims to be a grassroots organisation that is speaking on behalf of the membership. It is not yet clear whether there is any critical mass of support there, but certainly, you know, it's getting traction in the media. As we can see, it's on the front pages and there's a lot of coverage of it. But its seriousness remains to be seen, because there's going to be a lot that comes out of Number 10 and Conservative headquarters to try and calm down the nervousness that has occurred as a consequence of these bad local election results.
Meanwhile, Zoe, the last line on the front of the Eye says Starmer says Labour are real Conservatives and pledges to protect our way of life.
I mean, you'll get more detail on Starmer in the Guardian front page, in which he says that, you know, he's going to be like Blair on steroids. And specifically in that reference, he mentions Clause 4, which was, of course, Blair's taking on the left of the party. So his explicit signalling, including that we're the Conservatives now, is we're going to do away with the left of the party once and for all. But within what he said, he's talking about the kind of root and branch reforms, and he mentions the urgent demands of 65, the urgent demands of 45. He mentions reforming Labour governments that really predate Blair, and it strikes me that he's trying to do something slightly different to what he's been doing up until now. Take and basically touch sing every song in the canon. So he's not just trying to do a Blair reboot. He's trying to do a Attlee reboot. He's trying to do a Macmillan reboot. He's trying to kind of every single thing that anybody who's ever voted Labour likes about the party. He's trying to make that promise. Now, I think it's probably not as newsworthy as he thinks it is, because obviously every Labour leader wants to be like the Labour leaders that got elected. But I think it's definitely a kind of direct change of direction away from the past 2 years, which have been all about trying to remodel to a kind of centrist Blairite philosophy and close down the left.
Well, you mentioned the front of The Guardian, so let's bring that in next, shall we? Because the headline, as you say, expect Blair-style reforms on steroids, says Keir Starmer. Salma, is this the right direction to go in, do you think?
Look, is it the right direction? Well, that remains to be seen at a general election. But what is the logic behind this? The logic is that Labour in 2019 lost an enormous amount of ground in its heartlands to the Conservatives under, this Brexit issue and Boris Johnson. And so there is that attempt to recalibrate, to kind of, as Zoe says, move away from the Corbyn years of the left of the party. The difficulty, I think, for Starmer, as Zoe's outlined, is that, it's a hodgepodge of all successful Labour leaders. So he says he wants a clause 4 moment on steroids. But what is the clause 4 moment? What is he actually going to want to change? And I think until he sort of makes that clearer and what that change is then going to bring in terms of a cultural shift, it's just sort of words. So I don't actually know what he's getting at. So clause 4 is very symbolic of the Blair era. Until he puts some detail on it, I don't think it is a thing.
Yeah, and also, Zoe, the Guardian does make the point that, many in the party, especially to the left, are going to be frustrated by the U-turns that we've seen Keir Starmer make, or whether it's on tuition fees or nationalisation. And that is an understandable concern, isn't it?
Well, the left of the party have been incredibly frustrated for a really long time, right? And it's not, they're not just throwing their toys out of the pram. Keir became leader on 10 pledges, which were very like John McDonnell's economic programme. And ever since he got in, he's been trying to disavow anything that remotely resembles John McDonnell. And of course, his line would be, I've got to distance myself from the Corbyn years, and McDonnell was his shadow chancellor. But the truth is that there has been a kind of very sustained disavowal and repudiation of the left of his party for a really long time. So I think even though obviously tuition fees will be a blow to those who weren't paying attention, most people on that wing of the party sort of know that he's kind of not team Corbyn or Corbyn's successor. I think I don't know that it is as straightforward as that anymore, because there are kind of interesting things happening as well. He's sort of letting his front bench speak out a little bit more, whereas previously the message discipline was so intense that you very rarely heard what anybody except Keir Starmer thought. He seems to be, as we've seen, kind of touching a lot of kind of values points about Labour, which aren't Blair. And Blair is a very divisive figure in the party. So there is a lot of sense in going to kind of previous leaders and different models of victory and different models of reform. Yeah, for sure. It's not going to amount to a hill of beans till the manifesto comes out.
Mm-hmm. OK, and it's a similar theme in The Times. Let's sort of see what angle they've taken, Salma. They're talking about the shadow chancellor setting her sights on a decade in power, and also zooming in on the whole private schools issue and charitable status, which of course makes big headlines, doesn't it, for Labour? But in the general scheme of things, it's not really going to save the economy.
No, but I think this is part of that. I mean, this is a terrible phrase, but that sort of hygienic cleansing of a political party. And if I can reference my own experience, in the run up to the 2010 election, there was all this talk of decontaminating the Conservative brand. And we were always accused of not having enough sort of flesh on the bones of our policy. And what it strikes me here is that there is a similar process going on. So it's not sort of big, chunky policies that are being announced here. There's a sort of tonal shift and a directional shift that the Labour Party is taking because, as the local election showed, there is still a little bit of nervousness about this new entity under Keir Starmer and what it actually means. And Rachel Reeves also talking about this decade of being in power. I think, to some people that might sound like it's a foregone conclusion and Labour's taking it slightly for granted. But I think the intention is to say, look, we have a plan and we want to deliver it and it's for the long term. So this is, I think, really about a tonal shift as opposed to kind of laying any groundwork for any kind of serious interventions that are really going to get the voters talking.
Talking of which, sorry, Zoe, jump in.
Well, I was just going to jump in on Rachel because I think she actually is the shadow cabinet member who's made the most serious interventions. She sketched out the Green New Deal plan, which is 128 billion pounds of public spending, of state intervention in a green economy, and it is quite extraordinary. It's an extraordinary pledge, and it's bottomed out. It's very well thought through. It's costed. It's real. And I suppose that what I'm pleased about in both that story and the story which we're just about to talk about with Angela Rayner's plans is that those figures are now saying their piece. And Labour governments are much, much more successful when when there's more than one recognisable figure whose kind of personality, whose political personality voters can recognise.
OK, well, let's just talk about that story you mentioned. We've only got 30 seconds. Salma, you can perhaps outline it for us. I don't know how this is going to work for journalists, but bosses will be restricted from contacting their staff by phone, WhatsApp or email outside of working hours under a Labour government, according to plans expected to be in the party's general election manifesto.
Yes, this is something that has been looked at and trialled in France as a consequence of a high-profile case. And what this actually means is that people are allowed to have downtime. And, in this modern age where we've got technology, when our phones are pinging all the time, this idea that you're never off. And so that there is a sort of considered time that bosses can actually deal with their employees. And I think for a lot of professions, that's going to be difficult. But, that it is true. People are suffering from burnout. So I think it could prove to be quite popular, perhaps not in the business community, but certainly with a lot of voters.